I would like to welcome all in attendance to this election launch meeting of the Socialist Equality Party for the 2025 Australian federal elections. My name is Boddy, and I am one of two New South Wales Senate candidates for the SEP, and I'll be chairing this evening's meeting. Tonight, we will take two reports from our candidates, who I'll introduce shortly. After these reports, we will open up for questions and discussion, followed by a call for our election fund and concluding with some announcements. Our meeting is distinctive in many ways. Not only is the SEP actually holding a meeting in which the real situation in this election is being discussed, but the candidates on the platform and, you'll see in the audience, will answer your questions. Now, the official election campaign of the major parties, Labor, Liberal and the Greens, takes the form of a complete fraud. More than any other election, what passes as debates between Labor Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and opposition leader Peter Dutton is an absurd pantomime. All the fundamental and pressing questions facing working people, including the looming threat of war, erosion of democratic rights, and the decimation of living conditions, are not addressed. There is a concerted effort by all the major parties to cover up and remove the campaign from the world crisis. But more than any other recent federal election, it is leaking through. This is because the global situation is marked by an intensifying political and social volatility that can no longer be concealed. The coming to power of the fascistic President Donald Trump to the White House is the sharpest reflection of the international process of capitalist breakdown. Long-term geopolitical norms are shattering. It has been just 1 week since Trump announced sweeping tariff measures on the entire globe, both of perceived enemies and erstwhile allies. This caused the fourth largest downturn in the stock market in the post-war period, with some $6.6 trillion wiped off the books in the US alone. Now, the pace and magnitude of global changes are so rapid that even for us, finalizing a speech has become incredibly difficult. Just last night, Trump announced a 90-day hold on the tariffs, which has seen the stock market soar, some by more than 10%. So for our candidates, this has meant revising our contributions for tonight, but the reality of the Trump administration's flip-flopping have confirmed what the SEP and the International Committee of the Fourth International has been exposing, that these wild gyrations express the deep crisis of US capitalism. They have no answer whatsoever for the economic crisis they confront. This return to economic nationalism, like that of the 1930s, appears as economic madness, and it is. There is virtually not a single product on planet Earth that is produced just in one country. And this ranges from basic necessities like clothing and food to advanced technological products like cars and computers. It reflects the reality of a globally integrated economy where the production of goods is organized on an international scale. These tariffs will not only worsen the cost of living crisis for workers, but they are also setting the stage for severe global economic recessions. However, this cannot be explained away as just the madness of Trump. The return to economic nationalism, similar to Hitler's policies in the 1930s, is linked to the breakdown of capitalism, characterized by deepening economic turmoil, escalating militarism, and intensifying inter-imperialist rivalries. The major powers are driving an unprecedented military escalation, laying the groundwork for a global conflagration that could surpass even the catastrophes of the early 20th century. Now, the logic behind tariffs aligns with this war agenda. Their implementation is not merely about economics. They serve as a tool to reorganize and mobilize the national economy for war. Trump also does not operate alone. He has substantial support from segments of the ruling elite in the US who perceive the preparation for war, particularly with China, as the primary objective for US imperialism. Even with the overnight announcement of the tariff pause, Trump has revealed China as the essential core of this economic war. He declared that while the other reciprocal tariffs are paused and reduced to 10%, tariffs on Chinese goods would be raised to 125%, quote unquote, effective immediately. The crisis of world capitalism reverberates across the globe and stands as the central issue shaping the 2025 election, despite the efforts of all major political parties to cover it up. Even as the campaign began, the major parties were already in deep crisis. Labor entered the race polling below 30% in the primary vote, amid widespread anger over the worst cost of living decline since World War II, relentless militarism, and its active support for the genocide in Gaza. And the utter absurdity of the official election campaign was on full display Tuesday night during the first debate between Albanese and Dutton. As we noted, it elevated the campaign to new heights, or more accurately, new lows. On all substantive issues, they agree. Far from opposing the dictatorial measures of Trump, both candidates seek to position themselves as the best leader to work with him. Despite promising cost of living reliefs, neither has produced a single substantial policy. It is a campaign of political falsehoods and lies and underscores the crisis of the political establishment in Australia. Now, in these conditions of deep crisis, we boldly launch our election campaign. We aim to tell workers and young people the truth. Come May 3rd, nothing will be resolved. No matter which major party or minor government comes to power, war, austerity, and attacks on democratic rights will remain the agenda. However, our campaign is entirely unique. Like our comrades worldwide, our goal in this election is to unite workers globally in opposition to all governments, with the ultimate aim of abolishing the profit system. We are building an international anti-war movement of workers and youth to prevent World War III. As outlined in our election statement, we stand in total opposition to the fraud peddled by the Greens and various fake left parties like Socialist Alliance, who claim that moral appeals to the Labor government, who are actively complicit in war crimes, will somehow persuade them to change course. We oppose the ongoing erosion of workers' social rights, as the fortune of billionaires soar while there is heightened attack on public education, healthcare, and essential social services. This is closely tied to the attack on fundamental democratic rights, including the right to strike, which is being systematically dismantled. What is needed above all is revolutionary leadership. The working class needs its own mass socialist party, independent from and opposed to all of the capitalist parties. That is what the SEP is fighting to build, and we invite you to join our campaign, help distribute our material, and become a member of our party. We are the sole political organisation raising these essential issues, and for this, we have been effectively barred from appearing on the ballot paper under our name. Acting on anti-democratic legislation passed through by both Labor and the Coalition, the Australian Electoral Commission denied our application for official registration, despite the SEP fulfilling the burdensome requirement of submitting over 1,500 members. Now, this decision was not only aimed at excluding the SEP's name from the ballot, but at silencing the truth in the midst of the election campaign. Despite this anti-democratic attack, we have gathered over 750 signatures from electors in New South Wales, Victoria, and the electorates of Newcastle, Cornwall, and Oxley in just over a week. These were submitted to the AEC, which, after an extraordinary delay, they finally confirmed that our candidates could stand in this election. While we are barred from using our party name on the ballot paper, our candidate's name will still appear. And with that, I am pleased to announce our candidates tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'll be proudly standing on the Senate ticket in New South Wales. I will be joining Warwick Dove, a retired metal worker who joined the Socialist Labour League, or SLL, the predecessor of the SEP, in 1983. He is a member of our National Committee and plays a leading role in the fight to build rank-and-file committees, uniting workers across industries against a thoroughly corporatised union apparatuses. In Victoria, we'll also stand two Senate candidates, Keo Vongvixay and Taylor Hernan. Keo is a health worker who immigrated to Australia with his family as a refugee from Laos in 1981, escaping the devastation caused by US imperialism in his homeland. He grew up in public housing and joined the party in 1998, remaining active now for almost 3 decades. His running mate, Taylor Hernan, is a health science student at Melbourne's La Trobe University and also works as an environmental worker. He joined the SEP in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, horrified by the criminal response of governments here and worldwide and the adoption of the homicidal herd immunity policies. In addition to the Senate, we are standing 3 candidates in the lower house seats across the eastern states. In New South Wales, we are standing Robert Creech in Newcastle, which is a key working class city in the Hunter Valley. Robert was politicised by the experiences of the attacks on democratic rights during the War on Terror and the massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich following the 2008 global financial crisis. He plays a leading role in the Newcastle branch and is a writer for the World Socialist website. Now, our final 2 candidates will also join me on the platform to speak to you tonight. Mike Head, who will deliver the main report, is contesting the working class Brisbane electorate of Oxley. Mike has been a party member for 5 decades, joining in 1975 after the Labor government under Gough Whitlam revealed its true anti-working class agenda. Mike has written extensively for the World Socialist website, prior to which he served as the editor of the Australian section's newspaper Workers' News from 1985 until the establishment of the WSWS in 1998. He is also a member of our National Committee and the branch secretary for our branch in Brisbane. And our final speaker tonight, our first speaker tonight, I should say, will be Morgan Peach, who is running in the electorate of Caldwell in Melbourne, a working class seat that has been dominated by the Labor Party since 1984. Morgan is also a member of our National Committee and a leading member of the IYSSE. He joined the party in 2019 as a student at the University of Melbourne, and he writes for the World Socialist website on Southeast Asian social and political issues. And so with that, I would like to welcome Comrade Morgan to deliver the first report tonight.
Thanks, Max. And I also want to welcome everyone to tonight's meeting. The Socialist Equality Party are the only ones in the Australian federal election campaign laying bare the truth of the social reality confronting the population and seeking to warn, clarify, and prepare workers and young people for the immense struggles ahead. The official election campaign so far has been dominated by phony promises by Labor and the Liberal National Coalition to implement economic measures to address the skyrocketing cost of living in this country. The measures put forward by Labor, the Coalition, and the Greens, such as minuscule tax cuts or a similarly small temporary reduction in petrol prices, are totally inadequate. Nobody believes these promises will improve the lives of workers and young people living under a growing social crisis. This election is being held against a backdrop of enormous crisis for the world economy. Inflation and the rising cost of living have already inflicted financial misery and a historic cut in living standards for millions of working class households since 2019. But much worse is to come. The global economic turmoil is being intensified by the return to power of US President Trump and his vicious agenda of tariffs and economic trade war. Trump's measures are sending shockwaves around the world and will eliminate millions of jobs worldwide and send prices soaring. Under these conditions, the Labor government's pre-election budget promise of a $5 per week income tax cut in 16 months' time, with another $5 a week a year later, wouldn't even cover cover the cost of a cup of coffee. According to one media poll, only 16% of those who responded thought that Labor's sham pre-election budget last week would make them better off. What's the real situation facing working people in this country? Following the previous widely detested coalition government, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's administration has continued the biggest reversal in working class living standards of the post-World War II era, enforcing the burden of the global inflationary crisis fully onto the working class. Workers' average purchasing power has declined by 9% since 2019. 13 interest rate hikes have driven up mortgage payments by an average of around $1,500 a month, and rents have risen by an average of 36%, throwing record numbers of households into financial stress or homelessness. Food prices have risen by 27% since 2019. Insurance costs have soared by 47%, fuel 27%, and the cost of building a new home 40%. Over 82% of electorates nationally now have a majority of homes suffering household financial stress, which means they're barely able to cover day-to-day living expenses. In 2021, that figure was 8%, so that's a tenfold increase in less than 4 years. Unemployment is rising, with nearly 900,000 jobless workers struggling to barely survive on job seeker or youth allowance payments of just $56 a day. Poverty is also on the rise, as 1 in 8 people in Australia, that's 3.3 million people, including 1 in 6 children, or 761,000, live below the poverty line. Labor has also escalated the decades-long assault on health and education. Severely underfunded and understaffed public schools and hospitals have borne the brunt of further cuts, despite repeated strikes by educators and health workers calling for higher wages and better conditions. Meanwhile, at the other end of the social pole, the wealth of the billionaires is booming. The top 250 richest individuals in Australia are currently worth around $690 billion, headed by iron ore magnate and far-right Trump supporter Gina Rinehart on around $50 billion. This means their wealth has risen 47% since 2021, from around $470 billion. And I'd encourage everyone here tonight to read the SEP's powerful election statement, which goes through some of these figures and outlines the real severity of the social crisis. It's the only election statement in this campaign that actually addresses the reality. Now, who's responsible for this state of affairs? The rapid growth of poverty and stress on the one hand, and fabulous wealth on the other, has been overseen by the Albanese Labor government, acting on behalf of the interests of big business and the banks. Labor, coming into office in 2022 on bogus promises of a better future, has presided over the biggest cuts to health, education, and vital social services since the 1930s. Amid the growing international economic turmoil the past 3 years, they've ensured that massive amounts of wealth and resources have been stripped away from the working class and funneled into the pockets of the financial oligarchy and the military budget. The trade union bureaucracies have been fully complicit in this process. They've facilitated sellout agreements with corporate management across industries, making sure that wages stay well below the rate of inflation. Effectively, this means that real wages have been cut substantially under the auspices of the unions. Aligned with Labor, they are playing a vital role in maintaining the competitiveness of Australian capitalism on the world stage. Such levels of social inequality, the massive accumulation of wealth at the height of society, are not compatible with democracy. The ruling class, in order to preserve its wealth and privileges, is turning towards dictatorial forms of rule all around the world to suppress the growing opposition of the working class. This is being demonstrated most sharply in the United States. The Trump administration is the open rule of the American oligarchy. Trump is tearing up democratic forms of rule and imposing dictatorship. He's carried out unprecedented acts, and political opponents are being snatched from the streets by federal agents immigrants facing mass roundups, court orders against the administration are being ignored, and Trump is ruling by decree. But Trump's attacks are not a uniquely American issue, nor are they simply the result of his deranged personality. What his regime is trying to implement is the program of the capitalist ruling elite everywhere, and Australia is no exception to this. Australia's political establishment is undertaking a major assault on the basic democratic rights of the population. This is particularly focused on demonising and even outlawing mass opposition to war and genocide. Mass protests erupted in Australia and worldwide to the criminal Israeli genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, and especially its backing by the major imperialist powers from the United States to Australia. While supporting the Gaza genocide, the Albanese government has worked in league with the mostly Labor state administrations to slander protesters as anti-Semitic, using this as the pretext for a broad campaign against democratic rights. Using the big lie that opposition to the Israeli regime's war crimes is anti-Semitic, academics, artists, students, health workers, and many others have been vilified and threatened. Police, acting on behalf of the governments, have initiated prosecutions against prominent opponents of the genocide. Hate speech and anti-protest laws, potentially criminalising condemnations of Israel and Zionism, have been rushed through the parliaments. The SEP has particularly called attention to the brutal attacks on respected academic Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah, who faces the prospect of a sacking at Sydney's Macquarie University for opposing the genocide. She's been threatened at the direct behest of the Albanese government, which ordered the Australian Research Council to freeze her research grant. We also defend the two nurses at Sydney's Bankstown Hospital, who were cajoled by an Israeli social media influencer and Zionist provocateur into making politically backward comments on an online video chat platform. The nurses have been the subject of a public lynching by the entire political and media establishment, and now face up to 20 years in prison on bogus charges. The involvement of the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association in attacking these nurses is a warning to workers everywhere that the union bureaucracies are their enemy. While no effort has been too great to slander and attack opponents of the genocide and war, not one Labor MP has personally condemned the brutal execution of 15 Palestinian Red Crescent workers and UN aid workers by the fascist Israeli regime. But the repression goes far beyond the immediate question of Gaza. It has far broader implications. The SEP makes the starkest warning that this is part of an attack on the entire working class, and the same methods being used against students, academics, and others on the question of genocide will be used against workers who come into struggle against the corporate and political establishment. The government's campaign is aimed at creating a wartime atmosphere and strengthening the state apparatus in preparation for a US-led war against China in this region. All opponents of war, of militarism, and the policies of the major political parties will be subject to dictatorial measures. And that is particularly directed at young people. Already there are calls from military and other spokesmen that the all of government, all of nation effort, so-called, has to be undertaken in preparation for war, a war which daily becomes more imminent. Demands are being raised for national service and even conscription. It's young people who will be dragooned into a war for the survival of capitalism. Young people turning to the working class must and will be at the forefront of the fight against war. But it is not enough to be just anti-war. One has to have a perspective against the source of war, which is capitalism. I joined the IYSSE, the SEP's youth wing, out of profound opposition to war. I was first drawn to the SEP in 2017 due to its opposition to the war's US imperialism and the persecution of anti-war journalist and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. 2010 WikiLeaks exposures of US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan had a huge impact on me. They made me see what the wars in the Middle East were really about. They had nothing whatsoever to do with democracy, but were criminal wars by the US to dominate and plunder the region. The fact that it was the Labor government of Julia Gillard attacking Assange and defending war crimes in which Australian governments were deeply involved completely changed the way that I looked at Labor. But when the sexual assault allegations in Sweden were levelled against Assange, part of a US-directed frame-up aimed at demonising Assange and extraditing him to America, this slander and provocation was promoted by the pseudo-left organisations of Socialist Alternative and others, and it caused immense confusion among young people. It had the effect of breaking Assange from his base of support. So I became pessimistic about politics and tried to switch off and focus on my own personal matters. Then I met the IYSSE at university, who defended Assange and exposed the role of the false allegations. While I opposed war in the Middle East, I had really little to no understanding of the war drive by the US against China and Russia, or the real threat of world war. The first SEP meeting that I attended was on the centenary of the 1917 Russian Revolution. It was the first time I started to think about political developments seriously, in a historical context, and draw the conclusion that war is not the outcome of mad individuals, but is a product of the capitalist system itself, and that the contradictions that led to World War I and the Russian Revolution had not gone away, but were in fact approaching a crisis point again. So I call on students, both at high school and university, young workers, and all those who want a future, to make the decision to join this party and fight for a socialist future. The shift by the political establishment towards dictatorship and the growing social and economic crisis are major issues which will not be resolved through this election. The major parties represent the interests of the capitalist ruling class, which, under the economic shocks provided by Trump, is going to heighten austerity and dictatorship after this election, regardless of which party leads the government. Workers must understand that Labor is a party of capitalist rule that will not defend democratic rights. That task falls to the working class itself. The SEP is alone in advancing this perspective to build a socialist movement of the working class. But the working class needs its own mass socialist party, independent from and opposed to all of the capitalist parties. That's what the SEP is fighting to build. So again, I encourage everyone here to become involved in our election campaign over the next month and join the SEP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morgan, for that report. I think all in attendance will have found that both very interesting in terms of the details, both of the crisis of the situation here, including the absolute devastation of the cost of living, but also some ways moving to hear how a young person in that sense develops towards socialism and socialist politics. Just before I hand over to our main speaker, I will just remind everybody that after the main report, we will open up for questions and discussion to all of our candidates who are, as I mentioned in my opening report, here to answer questions tonight. So any questions at all, and you can submit questions to the chat prior to the conclusion of the report. But with that, I will hand over to Mike Head, who will give the main report for tonight.
Welcome, everyone. The Socialist Equality Party is standing candidates in the May 3rd federal election to help us take our socialist program out to the widest possible audience in the working class. Our campaign is not just about votes. Its message goes far beyond this election. We are fighting to develop a mass working class party based on the struggle for international socialism to overthrow the capitalist profit system and establish democratic workers' control over the world economy to provide for all, not just the oligarchs. We are doing so under unprecedented conditions on a global scale. Only 80 years since the end of World War II in Europe, the last catastrophic world war, capitalism is once again plunging into depression, world war, and fascism, as in the 1930s. Once again, the fundamental and irreconcilable contradictions of capitalism, analysed by the Marxist movement, are erupting to the surface. They are, above all, between the globalised world economy and the division of the planet into rival nation states, and between socialised production and the private appropriation of society's wealth by the capitalist class. Despite all the efforts of the political and media establishment, including Labor, the Coalition and the Greens, to cover up the impact of the world crisis, this reality is crashing through and starting to become increasingly evident to millions of people in this election campaign, as it is internationally. In Tuesday's so-called leaders' debate, Labor's Anthony Albanese absurdly claimed that Australia was, quote, well positioned to cope with an all-out economic war. The truth is that the Trump administration's tariff war marks the definitive end of the post-World War II order. Just a day after the supposed debate, last night, the US imposed 125% tariffs on China, quote, effective immediately. In an earlier period, such an economic blockade would have been recognised as an act of war in itself. This has huge implications for the world, including Australia. China is the second biggest economy in the world. It is also by far Australian capitalism's largest export market. This makes even clearer Washington's agenda: economic and military war against China, which successive US administrations since Obama's have designated as the greatest threat to US imperialism, regaining the global hegemony that it asserted last century after 2 world wars. That is combined with coercion to force every other country to align behind the US aggression. For now, the Trump regime's partial supposed pause has offered governments 90 days to provide lists of things they will do to line up against China, boost their military spending, and dismantle any policy, not just tariffs, that is seen as an obstacle to US corporate power. That includes any national programs, regulations, or supposed red tape hindering the operations of US conglomerates, from the tech giants to the pharmaceutical corporations. As one financial commentator in the US said this morning, the Trump White House has put a gun at the head of every other government. And in the meantime, a 10% tariff applies to all countries, as well as the earlier unveiled tariffs on steel, aluminium, and cars. Although the US and other financial markets jumped on the news, it would be wrong to see this as a back down by Trump on his underlying agenda, or simply a manipulation of the markets. Nor is this just a negotiating tactic, the so-called art of the deal, as media pundits are claiming. This is not a poker game, nor a New York real estate deal. This is the world economy. That is why, in response, the regime in Beijing raised its tariffs on US imports to 84% and again vowed to, quote, fight to the end. It knows that China's very economic survival is at stake. This is ominous, raising the spectre of a nuclear war. At the same time, as today's World Socialist website Perspective explains, Trump's so-called tariff pause was driven by a fear of an imminent financial system meltdown, starting with the bond market. It's another expression of the deepening crisis of US imperialism and the capitalist order itself. Australia and its working people are not immune. How can they be? In fact, despite all the phony official election campaign talk about resilience and the puny token so-called cost of living promises being made, Australian capitalism is among the most vulnerable in the world. Not only is China, by far, Australian capitalism's biggest market, the next three biggest export destinations are also threatened by Trump's tariff war: Japan, South Korea, and India. Once the election is out of the way, regardless of what government, majority or minority, is cobbled together, the historic cut to working class living conditions over the past 5 years will go far deeper. Yesterday, there was another warning sign of what is to come. Treasurer Jim Chalmers suddenly called an emergency meeting of the financial agencies, including the Reserve Bank, to discuss how to deal with the impact of the Trump White House's tariff war. Next, Chalmers met with the big business organisations. Not a word has been released about what they discussed or planned, but they are demanding a ratcheting up of so-called productivity of workers. Now, we know from our campaigning to collect the more than 750 signatures we had to win to stand our candidates that the actions of the fascistic Trump administration are fueling anxiety and opposition among ordinary people in Australia, as they are around the world. There is hostility to Trump's economic war, dictatorial measures, huge cuts to jobs and public services, and stepped up militarism around the globe. Reserve polling last week found that an estimated 60% of the Australian population is hostile to Trump and what he represents, and a significant number of respondents linked this sentiment to fears of a US war with China. Such media polls are only a pale and distorted expression of the anti-fascist and anti-war sentiments in the working class. So we are standing in this election to provide such sentiments with a perspective and a program that represents the interests of the working class in this country and worldwide. Now, let me emphasise, Trump's policies are not those of an individual, but of the corporate oligarchy that he represents. He is the product of decaying American capitalism. He speaks for a ruling class that is determined to maintain its wealth and power by any means. Trump, like his hatchet man, Elon Musk, the world's wealthiest individual, personifies the oligarchy that is violently restructuring world politics. More fundamentally, they are an expression of the bankruptcy of capitalism globally and all its political servants, including the Democrats in the US and the Labor Party in Australia. Together, they are once again creating the conditions for an even more disastrous world war while reproducing all the barbarism of the 1930s, from economic crisis to mass poverty, fascism and dictatorship. Trump, as we've said, is not the disease, but one of its most malignant symptoms. He's only been able to take office for the second time because of the warmongering and deep attacks on working class conditions inflicted by the previous Democrat administrations of Obama and Biden. And there are parallels here with the role of the Albanese Labor government. In the United States, the headquarters of world capitalism, the Trump administration is moving systematically to establish a dictatorship. It is implementing a fascist program aimed at abolishing basic democratic rights, consolidating unchecked executive power, and crushing all opposition, not just on university campuses, but in the working class. In fact, the Trump regime is carrying out a war on the American working class, firing hundreds of thousands of federal workers, destroying public health and social programs, dismantling public education, and shredding workers' contracts. And these are the benchmarks being set for governments worldwide, including in Australia. Internationally, the Trump administration is preparing for war. Its tariffs amount to a declaration of economic war against the entire world under the banner of, quote, "Make America Great Again." These trade war measures are economic insanity, even more than they were in the 1930s. Today, production is far more globalised than it was then. World financial markets are now spinning from day to day, raising the spectre of another Great Depression as occurred before World War II. In fact, Trump's tariffs go far beyond the 20% tariffs imposed by the US Hoover administration via the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930, which deepened and extended the Great Depression. But as we've explained on the World Socialist website, as Leon Trotsky did in the 1930s, behind this economic madness is another agenda, that of war against China and any other threat to US capitalist domination. We are witnessing, as Trotsky warned, the volcanic eruption of US imperialism at its most vicious in its decline. That is why Trump has declared that the social catastrophes and financial disasters already caused by his administration, which is recklessly ripping apart the post-World War II order, is the, quote, medicine that must be taken to restore US corporate power. Trump's measures will intensify global conflict and produce massive economic and social dislocation, including in Australia, and also within the United States itself, fueling layoffs, inflation, and deepening attacks on the conditions and basic rights of the working class. Trump has also pledged to, quote, finish the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, begun under Biden, to, quote, annihilate Yemen, annex Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal, all to help wage all-out war on China. And there are direct parallels between that and what Hitler attempted in the 1930s. Now, last weekend, demonstrations were held across America against Trump's grab for total power. As only the World Socialist website reported, millions took to the streets, as in as many as 1,600 separate protests. This shows the opposition building up among workers and youth in the US. But the crucial question is political perspective. Against all those trying to trap this dissent in the hands of the Democratic Party, which created the conditions for Trump and has refused to oppose Trump, except on demanding an intensification of the war against Russia in Ukraine. The working class must be armed with a real understanding of the real nature of fascism. It's not a temporary individual aberration, but a product of the historic breakdown of the capitalist system. The fight against fascism must become a conscious fight against capitalism itself. It requires a mass movement of the working class for the expropriation of the oligarchs, the establishment of workers' power, and the reorganisation of society on the basis of social need, not private profit. This fight must be international. Workers must unite with their class brothers and sisters around the world in a common struggle to end capitalism and build socialism. As Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels explained in the Communist Manifesto as early as 1848, there is only one force that can overthrow capitalism and take humanity forward, and that is the world working class, which is created by capitalism itself. As in the US and internationally, similar political issues are raised in Australia against all those seeking to tie workers and young people to the capitalist political establishment by saying that we have to support Labor or the Greens as supposed lesser evils to the coalition. We will give no preferences to any of these capitalist parties in the election. We are campaigning for a complete break from this entire political straitjacket and a turn toward building rank-and-file committees to advance the struggle for a genuine socialist alternative. Let me make three essential points. First and foremost, our campaign is not just an Australian one. It is part of a global fight by our World Party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the ICFI. As we say in our election statement, our election campaign, like those of our co-thinkers around the world, is aimed at uniting workers globally in opposition to all the governments with the perspective of abolishing the profit system. That's why we stand against all forms of nationalism and patriotism, which seek to divide workers against each other and tie them to the increasingly ruthless profit demands and war plans of their so-called own national capitalists. Albanese and Dutton have refused to criticise Trump on any front. Instead, they're competing with each other to prove they will work with him Most recently, this week, they've both pledged to end a Chinese company's lease of the Darwin commercial port. They're rushing to demonstrate their commitment to the US war plans against China, which require the use of Darwin as a US naval base as it was in World War II against Japan. We've warned in our election statement that their alignment with Trump is not just a matter of backing the US military alliance. It also indicates their own similar agenda of slashing social spending to pay for massive military expansion, making immigrants and international students scapegoats of the housing and social crisis, and suppressing all dissent, starting with the witch hunting against opponents of the genocide in Gaza. Second, none of this will be halted through protests and appeals to the powers that be and their political servants, including the Greens, who are pleading to join or prop up a minority Labor government, as they did with Gillard in 2010. As we say in our election statement, that has been demonstrated by the mass movement that developed in opposition to the Gaza genocide, despite some of the largest and most sustained anti-war protests in this country and globally. The slaughter in Palestine continues. Responsibility lies with the Greens and fake left parties such as Socialist Alternative and Socialist Alliance, which have subordinated all opposition to moral pleas to the very same Labor government that is participating in the war crimes. And as we also point out in the election statement, the onslaught on social conditions has produced massive anger, but in one industrial dispute after another, workers have been sold out by the corporatised trade unions, which function as the industrial police force of governments and big business. Now these same union bureaucrats are urging workers to vote Labor. But as our candidate Warwick Dove has commented on the World Socialist website, they're trying to do so under conditions in which the gulf between them and workers has never been greater. Third, we say that above all, workers need a new party. This election will resolve nothing for the working class. None of the pressing issues, from the soaring cost of living to the running down of public health, education and housing, the ever more staggering social inequality and the suppression of dissent, can be answered on a national basis. The capitalist crisis globally and in Australia means that major social struggles are in the offing. Above all, however, they require revolutionary leadership. The working class needs its own mass socialist party, independent from and opposed to all the capitalist parties. That is what our party is fighting to build. In this election, as in every other, the Greens and the shooter left groups will peddle the lie that it's necessary to vote for Labor to keep the coalition out. That lesser evilism has always been a fraud. While it once claimed to represent workers, Labor has been the main buttress for Australian capitalism, coming to office particularly in every period of war and economic breakdown to impose the sacrifices on workers and young people. Today, lesser evilism is a politically criminal attempt to chain workers and young people to a political establishment that is hurtling toward war, a massive offensive against the working class and dictatorship. Let me emphasise this in relation to the Greens. As we say in our election statement, the Greens have no fundamental differences with this agenda. They are a capitalist party that defends the dominance of the banks and major corporations over society, as well as militarism and war. As the climate change spins out of control, the Greens promote the hoax that environmental disasters can be averted in a world where corporate profit and national interest are the overriding priorities. In this election, their entire pitch is to form a coalition government with Labor, which would continue Australia's support for the Gaza genocide and accelerate the war against China. To make that clear, the Greens began their campaign with the announcement of a military program for the acquisition of missiles and drones, supposedly for national defence. but for purposes of war. And they said this was just the beginning of their war plans. I won't review today all the policies that we advanced in the election statement. This is a central one. Place the banks and the corporations under public ownership and democratic workers' control. Expropriate the fortunes of the billionaires. The working class must control the social wealth it produces. We conclude our statement as follows. We appeal to all workers and young people to vote for our candidates to signal your support for a socialist perspective. But more than that, become involved in our campaign, helping to break the corporate media's silence on these crucial issues and develop a discussion in the working class on the way forward. Above all, we call on workers and youth who want to fight for a socialist future to join the Socialist Equality Party and build it as the new mass party of the working class. So we urge everyone in this meeting to become active in our campaign in every way you can. Donate to our election fund and apply to join the SEP. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mike, for those remarks. And I think all who have been listening will really grab the significance or grasp the significance of the international situation and the crisis that is unfolding globally and its reflection in this country. And I can see through the chat with some of the questions that are already coming in that there are numbers on some of these questions, including the question of the tariffs and their kind of implications worldwide, which I'll go through. I think we do have, as I said in the chat, numbers of questions coming through, which our candidates will seek to answer, not just us on the panel, myself, Mike and Morgan, but also our other candidates. So I'll just read out some of the questions now. I'll hand over to some of our candidates to answer them. And as I said, I'll encourage more questions to come through and we'll add them to the list. Our first question is from Kerry from Goulburn, who said, early question to concentrate on, as a consequence of economic capitalist warfare, workers' superannuation is under threat. How did super funds end up in the stock market? How is the working class to understand their relationship to this shackle when there is a direct interest in its fortunes? I'll just read a few questions and then I'll hand over for different candidates to answer. There was a question from Vicky. Which one is more dangerous, trade protectionism or globalization? Tariffs have at least seen a reduction in corporate wealth, but there should be a decrease in interest rates. So I'm wondering, is this better than globalization? As in, isn't a decrease in interest rates better for young people trying to get into the housing market? It's a question. And then there's another question here from Charlie about his internet, saying it's spotty, but could you repeat how to vote for the SCP candidates at the end of this meeting in case I missed that part? So there are other questions which we'll get to. Just to answer Charlie's question first, what I would encourage you to do, and we will put the candidate's name in the chat again, is to take note of all of our names. The drawing of the order in which the candidates will be presented on the ballot paper is going underway today and tomorrow, and we will be given notification of that drawing, and we can tell you after that, and we will develop how to vote cards exactly where we are placed on the ballot paper. For the Senate, we'll be grouped together above the line, and we'll tell you that number. For those in the lower house, comrades Morgan, Mike and Robert, they will be in one of the orders in the lower house ballot paper. But at this stage, take note of our names, search for us on the ballot paper. We very much appreciate all the votes we receive, and we will send out proper how to vote cards later on. So in regards to the question from Kerry on superannuation, I'll hand over to Robert Creech, who is our candidate in the lower house seat of Newcastle.
Hi, and just want to welcome everyone to this meeting. I wanted to address the question from Kerry, I hope I've got it right, which is how do you get the working class to understand the relationship to the stock market when their super funds are entwined in it? They have a direct interest in the fortunes of their supers. Well, I just briefly, one could also pose with workers owning mortgages, savings, all these other little fortunes. Why should they take on the capitalist system? First off, workers don't have fortunes under capitalism. I thought that was an important report that Comrade Max wrote not too long ago, which was on the state of retirees, which is that a quarter of them almost now live in poverty. And that's a figure that's doubled almost over the last decade. Super, just want to establish, that was introduced by the Keating Labor government as a means to no longer require the government to pay for workers in retirement. Rather, workers pay for it themselves. Instead of government paid pensions, they take workers' money and then give it back to them in their old age. But even doing that, workers are denied their own money, their own standard of living. They're being robbed behind their backs. Trump's tariffs are having or pose a huge threat to workers' retirement, but it's part of a broader cost of living crisis and the crisis of capitalism internationally. Workers' fortunes don't lie under the system of capitalism, full stop. It's repeating the worst crimes and disasters of the 20th century, not just of a financial character, but socially and politically. Genocide, fascism, World War, they're all intertwined. Millions of workers and young people are becoming radicalized because they're recognizing capitalism is, for what it is, exploitation, parasitism, robbery. I think it's important in our election statement, actually, we point to the fact that the election coincides with the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and that all the claims that the horrors of World War II, tens of millions of people died, has a huge effect on political, social consciousness. All the claims that that's not going to happen again are belied by Trump's tariffs. World War II it came about largely as a result of trade wars in the 1930s, and that is now being reinitiated. There was mention of US debt today. When I was born, US debt was $3 trillion. In 2003, roughly when I left primary school, it was only 4 trillion, and it's just ballooned since by decades. 15 trillion in 2011. In 2025, it was 36 trillion. This is a financial system ballooning out of control, and now it's preparing for World War. So this election takes place under conditions where it's leading to a third World War. And it's part of a broader cost of living crisis. Rent, groceries, tariffs. A key part of our election platform is stating that this election is a fraud. None of the important issues are being addressed. Labor said in the last election, workers would have a better future. Now they lamely say that they'll be better off than under the Liberals if you vote for Labor. The Australian economy is completely subject to international developments and these trade wars. Our fight is to mobilise the working class internationally for workers' governments and for their labour no longer to be expropriated, to be misused in enriching a tiny few, but also critically results in anarchy for the economic system that we live under. You can't plan anything scientifically, democratically. And rather under workers' government, that wealth would be used to meet social need. As Marx says, we have a world to win, much greater fortunes than a workers' paltry superannuation funds under capitalism.
Thanks, Robert. Taylor, who is our candidate in the Senate, joining Keo, would also like to make some points on that question. So I'll hand over to Taylor, and then I'll read out some more questions after he gives his answer.
Thanks, Max. As Robert said, superannuation was first introduced by the Labor government of Prime Minister Paul Keating in 1992 as a compulsory, a phenomenon. And in effect, superannuation comes from workers' wages, and it, as Robert said, it was introduced to force workers to pay for their own retirement. The superannuation pool is, I believe, at $1.7 trillion, and that's been amassed by stripping wages from every worker, every week for decades. And the Labor government has, recently boosted superannuation contributions, and what it's really doing is making more funds available to finance capital. But it's also, what Labor is working to do is to attempt to reduce the reliance of retired workers on pensions. Labor's superannuation policies are really dictated by the banks, and they remove an increased share from workers' pay packets, and place their future retirement at the mercy of the markets. There were, what shows a fraudulent character of claims that workers will be sustained due to this superannuation is that a growing number of Australian retirees are facing financial hardship after decades in the workforce. According to the Australia Institute, 22.6% of retirees now live in poverty, a figure that has nearly doubled over the past decade. More than 90% of older Australians receive the full or partial pension, and for many it is not just a supplement to their superannuation or savings, but their only source of regular income. This income, however, falls completely short of covering basic living costs, even including utilities, subsidies for utility bills. A single pensioner receives, I believe, a maximum of $1,144 per fortnight, and couples receive $1,725 per fortnight. It's woefully inadequate for many retirees. And what this really shows is that a stark, wealth inequality exists among retirees. I think, there's a real crisis facing retired renters in particular, and that has been building for decades. And, this is really has been driven by the introduction of compulsory superannuation. And, there's been a decline in the proportion of Australians receiving the full aged care pension. And, what has been taking place is a politically, bipartisan effort to reduce the pension payment and reduce the costs of, government spending. What else I could add is that, the current Albanese Labor government, having narrowly scraped into office in 2022 federal election, has really further deepened this crisis. And as others have gone through, other candidates, is that it's really instigating a program of austerity and cuts to social spending. And, as a result, poverty has deepened across Australia. 3.3 million people now live below the poverty line, and 2 million experience food insecurity. Extremely, staggering numbers. And while, millions struggle to secure basic necessities, corporate profits, and billionaire wealth continue to soar, and vast sums are funneled into the military in preparations for war. This, I think, I could state my solidarity with other candidates and the meeting, is that this crisis really underscores the urgent need for a socialist reorganisation of society, one that really prioritises human need over private profit, and guarantees stable, affordable, and dignified housing for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. Just before I hand over to Mike, who will answer the question from Vicky, I'll just read out a couple of other questions that we'll look to answer. There is one from Brett, who has raised, it's interesting to note Trump's political manoeuvres with Putin, ? There was a comment from Stefan, who said, I'll bet a bunch of Trump's billionaire buddies made a fortune on the recovery. Talk about insider trading. There is also another question, sorry. There have been numbers of different questions. I mean, there have been some questions about the development of consciousness, how that works, how it, what are the processes that give rise to the development of consciousness amongst workers of young people. And there's also a comment about lesser evilism, something of a stumbling block in the discussion. Candidates may be able to speak to that. And there's also a question from Gino, which will be answered. What is the strategy for growth prior to and after the next federal election here? And in regards to growth, Gino means the growth of the SEP and the party. But first, I'll hand over to Mike to answer Vicky's question.
Thanks, Max. Well, there's a great number of very important questions, and that's great. The more, the better. I just make one point on superannuation before I go on to Vicky's question. The other purpose of the superannuation scheme set up by Keating and the ACTU was to further corporatise the trade unions. They became partners in giant investment funds. These funds, which have shared boards of union bureaucrats and employer representatives, now sit on, I think it's now more than $4 trillion. That gives them a huge stake in themselves and exploiting the labour power of their own members by driving up the profit rates for their investments. For example, in Brisbane, one of the tallest buildings is, owned by Cbus, the fund of the CFMEU. So there's that aspect to it as well. But that epitomises the role of the trade union apparatuses today, not just in Australia, but globally. They are fully part of, with very deep material interests and very well paid as well, of the apparatus of rule. But just to turn to Vicky's question, again, this is important. She asks about globalisation and tariffs, which is better. Well, we're opposed to both, but I'd like to make this point about globalisation. We're not opposed to globalisation, although it's a process driven by the profit demands of capitalism itself. There's also an objective process. We are for the development of the world economy, but the issue is who owns it, who controls it, for what uses is it put. It vastly intensifies, expands the productive capacity of humanity. But the issue is it's siphoned off by, the oligarchs, and all based on their rival nation states. As I said in my remarks before, this is a fundamental contradiction that capitalism can't resolve between the progressive, you might say, globalization of the world's productive forces, but it's divided by capitalism into nation states that are fighting each other for the resources, whether it be, the critical minerals in Ukraine or in Russia or China or anywhere else. And that gives rise to the use of nationalism to seek to get workers to kill each other economically and, in the end, militarily, as happened in 2 world wars. And the union bureaucrats, again, are in the forefront of this. They support protectionism. We have today the UAW, the Auto Workers Union in America, singing the praises of Donald Trump because he's put on tariffs, supposedly to defend the jobs of American car workers. It's a complete fraud. I mean, the only jobs that will be created will be completely automated, robotized, and producing at a cheaper rate, if they can, than where the same corporations have taken their factories off to China and elsewhere. So we are opposed to, absolutely, to the control of the world economy by the oligarchs, and the use of now resorting to tariffs. I mean, just make one point. Tariffs were abolished substantially in the 50s and 60s, or by the 70s anyway, because the ruling class understood also that they had to stabilise global capitalism to prevent the threat of socialist revolution. That's what arose out of World War too. The fact that the American capitalist class, not just Trump, but the American capitalist class as a whole, is now heading down this road is, as we tried to explain, a sign of turning towards the agenda of war. I'll just make one final point about the housing market, because Vicky was asking, would interest rates being cut make it easier for young people to buy a house? Well, if interest rates are cut, it's because the economy is crashing. So there'll be a deeper recession, massive unemployment, and therefore cuts in workers' conditions, which will make it even harder for young people. But the other question is, who controls the housing market? Why are housing prices so high? I mean, two basic causes is the fact that, again, it's owned and controlled by the billionaires. I mean, Harry Trugerboff, the second or third richest person in Australia, makes his fortune out of driving up house prices and rents. I forget the figure exactly, but in the recent rich list in the Australian, they revealed that between them, these billionaires control hundreds of thousands of housing lots around the country, which they keep off the market until the price goes up high enough to make a fortune out of it. And the second thing, of course, is the destruction of public housing, as is happening in Melbourne right now. And our party is leading the fight against this, forming an action committee of the residents of the public housing towers that are about to be demolished if the Victorian Labor government gets away with it. And that's another turning point in the destruction of public housing, which forces people into the hands of the private owners and private landlords. So I just think to answer these questions, you do have to go deeper. And just before I finish, if you read the statement of principles of the Socialist Equality Party, which we urge people to do, it's the basis for being a member of our party, you'll see we take a very clear position against the so-called fair trade, free trade. The question, above all, is who owns and controls the productive forces of humanity, of the world. I just make those points for now.
Thanks, Mike. To answer the next question from Gino, I will hand over to Keo. But just to add to his question, there's just a follow-up point that Gino was raising in the chat. Do you think that unions had to go forward with a capitalistic approach to be able to build a war chest or treasury for the purpose of fighting back? As you have mentioned, the CBUS is a prime example. They then invest somewhat in the construction centre. There's also one other question that we'll see if we can get to from Christopher. Do you see the US dollar being replaced as reserve currency of the world? If so, when do you see that happening? And what chaos could result from America being unable to print its own money to fund its national debt? So I'll hand over now to Keo, who would like to answer Gino's question.
Thank you for attending the meeting. I just wanted, answering Gino's question, a little story about myself, how I came to be in the party, which is in the 1996 election, which is, we are in the election itself again. Back then I was working in a factory for $9 an hour, had 5 cents in my pocket, had enough of the Labor Party, but just didn't know what else to do, so I went down the street, and next thing you know, I ran into a campaign team. And, like any ordinary person out there, worker who's disgruntled with all the whole voting system and nothing seems to be changing, I was walking past the table, and next thing you know, we have this loud, booming American voice coming at me, talking about socialism. And that moment, I had to stop. I always had this conception in people in the United States were all anti-communist. That was in my mind. So I had to go and speak with him. And Jerry White was, here campaigning our election. And that's part of the party that I joined. We're an international party. And he was down here and we talked about, what the issues were. And so I needed to know more because, I grew up in Laos where we had a war and, the struggle and what I was listening to when I was growing up was about social equality, socialism. So there was a contradiction in my own thoughts, but talking with Jerry and learning more about the party perspective, led me to joining the party and, becoming active in the whole process. And I say to everyone who's in this meeting, you are an active component of it. When you're talking about the growth of the party, you do play a role in educating workers. But to do that, I certainly suggest or recommend that you, read more and learn more about the party's perspective itself and begin to, unravel some of these questions that you have and begin to find some answers. And then, take it out to the working class. And then that's what I've done. And that is the plan of the party. I mean, our perspective is to educate and clarify the working class, right now, before the election and after the election. I mean, the election creates a condition where we can put our perspective forward even more, which is, but the election is not going to resolve the question for the working class. What we deal with that, all comrades have spoken to, the threat of war and so on, and costs of living going up and so on. These are continuously pushing against, the working class. So no one can escape that part of it. But finding an answer or clarifying some of the situation and political perspective that we'll be putting forward is what we're going to win the workers to our side. The conditions being created by the capitalist breakdown itself for our perspective to go further into the working class. So we're asking everyone, social media, people letterboxing, to be an active component in building the perspective of the party. And that's how I would answer. And if you want to know more, certainly, I encourage you to participate in a much more active role if you're not already in, putting our perspective forward. I mean, that's, we can't walk away from the situation, as comrades have mentioned, they drive the war itself. The next war would end human civilization, and the consequences of that I'm certainly not prepared to accept. I just wanted to say that for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Keo. Warwick will also make some points on this question.
Yeah, I mean, the questions that Gino's asked are very, very important, and I think if you think how workers come in contact through the experiences around protests, others, particularly over the years, has been through experiences within the trade union movement via strikes, pickets, and other activities, and more recent, with the number of wars in the Middle East, the Iraq period, the attacks on Iraq by the US and NATO, and now the slaughter of the people in Gaza. It affects people that they start looking around, why are these things happening? Why historically, is this returning once again to slaughter? As the party points out, the current situation of trade war, while military aggression is taking place, particularly with NATO and the US, backed by its supporters in this region, and obviously throughout the NATO countries in Europe, whether it be a more right-wing government, politically, conservative, or traditional social democratic or Labor governments, the ruling elite of all countries backs the dominant need for imperialism and for their own particular nation to get a place in the sun, so to speak, in the area of profit-making and wealth for the narrow layer at the top of society. Alongside that, is a whole host of assorted pseudo-left parties, but particularly you have to look at the role that the trade unions play in particularly the larger and more organised workplaces. And, the role they've played. I'll just home in on a few of the ones here in Australia of recent. Nurses have struggled. It's been the trade union bureaucracy that have kept them divided and kept the health industry divided into different sectors. The doctors at the moment are striking, trying to get improvements. Overall, it points to a huge healthcare crisis. Ordinary working people can't get proper care because of costs and expenses. the trade unions play a very evil role in a sense that they maintain the divisions amongst different areas of workers. The same happened recently with warehouse workers in Woolworths. A layer of pseudo-left political tendency came around, tried to keep workers tied to the trade union bureaucracy, appealing to the company to give concessions, to agree to some form of amelioration of the difficult conditions that workers confront. But basically, the companies in all these situations, the health departments, the political leaders, put forward there's no money in the kitty. They can't do anything to lighten the load on the backs of workers. And the trade union bureaucracy inevitably, after a period of wearing down workers in struggle, forces a deal down the workers' throats to accept a compromise, and workers often get demoralised. When the party intervenes, we come into immediate conflict and clash with the conceptions that there are reforms available, and we come into conflict with the role that the role that the trade union bureaucracy has in that it is atomising, dividing, and getting workers to accept the format that they can only really participate on the basis of what their labour can get them, if their daily, their weekly, their monthly wage, salary, and that's it. We put forward a higher level that the working class develops and builds all forms of improvement in society, and actually control in the way they work and understand how workplace functions. And workers should be, democratically able to, organise and work and rule and run their working place. And it's not just within Australia, but it's internationally. The same processes happen in every country. And I think it's through that conflict and our fight to expose the role of their current leaders that creates the conditions for workers to come forward and, ask questions and fight. We fight with them to broaden their education, their political outlook, and join the party. I mean, throughout all periods of history, workers have come into clashes with employers and at different and varying times with the weak, treacherous, and national supporting role of trade unions. I mean, I won't go on much longer, but the history shows that at every turn, the trade union bureaucrats will side with the national bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the bankers, the financiers, to maintain the status quo. I mean, the small town of Lithgow, west of Sydney, the first steelworks in Australia was there. At the initial startup of that, there was clashes with the owners and the managers very early, long before the establishment of BHP. The workers came together. They confronted police, armed police, threatening to shoot them if they didn't break and go back to work and stop their strike. There's a long history of that in Australia, developed and in other countries, but particularly I'll raise Australia. In Hunter Valley, same thing happened in the Second World War. Second World War, trade union bureaucrats backed everything that was required for the national interest to assist, to mobilise the whole of society, divide up the work that had to be done amongst all areas of society and back the use of, workers in the military, in a war of capitalist conflagration, be it in Germany, be it in the Japanese theatre of war, and, the questions that how those workers were pitted against one another in an earlier period to, be forced for their national interest to Japan to expand. Workers in Australia were told the same thing: you must defend your national interests. Propaganda is used. The Japanese were coming to Australia, we were told. Workers had two choices: fight or work. And by that, the trade union bureaucrats and the politicians of the day meant that if you're not in the war fighting, you'll be forced to work. No such things as strikes and defending conditions. And these are the very real dangers that workers confront today. the third imperialist war is a real possibility. And it can only be fought by parties such as ours and workers consciously becoming educated and learning the lessons of history. And the examples I've given of some, the Second World War period and others can only be avoided and headed off with a mobilised working class in the interest of internationalism and socialism. And, I think that's some of the important things that workers have to take out of, the examples and the struggles over the protests, examples of what's happened on picket lines, the betrayal of workers in all areas. And I think the joining of our party is key to that. The SEP, in every country, its sections are sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International. And I think the reading of the website plays an important role in that education. So I think, I'll just leave it at that. But I'll hand it back to Max for any further questions or discussion.
Thanks, Warwick. To just answer one final question, I'm going to hand over to Beams, a leading writer on the World Socialist website on Marxist political economy, a founding member of the SEP, and was a former national secretary where he took that role for 35 years. So I'll hand over to Nick to make some points on the question on the US dollar.
Yeah, well, I'll start off by making the point that what has taken place with the elevation of Trump and the tariffs is the complete destruction of what remained of the post-war order, which comrades have referred to. And to take up a theme that Warwick introduced, I think is very important, the study of history. And we need to examine this crisis. We need to follow the history of this development of the post-war order, and particularly on the role of the dollar. The dollar was established at the Conference of Bretton Woods in 1944 as the international currency, but it had to be backed by gold. That is a source of real value. That situation continued from now looking back, a relatively short period of time, from 1945-46 to 1971, when because of the trade deficits and balance of payments deficit, the US could no longer guarantee that it would redeem dollars as it had agreed to at Bretton Woods at the rate of $35 an ounce. Nixon went on TV on Sunday night of August the 15th, 1971, and said the gold window's closed. No longer will we redeem your dollars in the form of gold. Now, what happened? Then the global financial system, global currency, became a fiat currency. What that means is it was just simply backed not by real value, but by the power of the American state. That's what sustained it. In the period since then, we've had the growing disintegration, decline of that power, and the American financial system has become subject to, because of rampant speculation, criminal activities, and so on, parasitism, become subject to a series of financial heart attacks. October 87, the global stock market crash. Asia financial crisis, 97-98, which saw the collapse of long-term capital management. 2008, the global financial crisis. And very relevant to the present situation, March 2020, when the US Treasury market, the bond market, completely froze. You could not sell a US bond on the market. The leading international financial mechanisms froze. That required the intervention of the US Fed, which spent something like $4 trillion at one point to prop up the market. At one point, they were spending $1 million a second. This crisis has erupted once again, very much centred on the Treasury market, as we point out, the bond market, interest rates rising, a sell-off of Treasury debt, and so on, which threatened to cascade into another Black Monday. And the dollar was also part of that. One of the aspects of this present situation was not only a sell-off of treasuries, but also growing lack of confidence in the US dollar. And the significance of dollar supremacy was outlined quite clearly before Donald Trump took his second presidency by a leading writer, Fareed Zakaria, in the Washington Post in 2021. I'll just read out what he said because it's very relevant. He said, American politicians have gotten used to spending seemingly without any concerns about deficit. Public debt has risen almost fivefold from roughly 6.5 trillion 20 years ago to 31.5 trillion today. Well, it's now 36. The Fed has solved a series of financial crashes by massively expanding its balance sheet 12-fold from around 730 billion 20 years ago to about 8.7 trillion today. All of this works only because of the dollar's unique status. If that wanes, America will face a reckoning like none before. He doesn't spell it out explicitly, but it means, the emergence of the American working class and the crisis of the economy and the emergence of socialist revolution. Donald Trump emphasized the importance of dollar supremacy in his address to the New York Economic Club back in July when he was campaigning for the presidency. He said losing dollar supremacy as the international global currency would be the equivalent to losing a war. It's this supremacy of the dollar which enables the US ruling class to do what no other ruling class can do in any country, that is to run up debts ad infinitum. Now there are clear signs of lack of confidence in the US dollar. There are attempts to move outside it. China is selling, US treasuries. Other foreign investors are selling US treasuries. The price of gold is risen to record heights of over now $3,000 an ounce, which is an expression of the lack of confidence in the US dollar as the international global currency. And I think, that underscores the depth of this crisis. Now, it's not a question of, predicting. Like, there's no peaceful solution to this crisis of the US dollar. It's not to be, some conference is going to be held and we decide, oh, yes, we're going to have a new international currency. No, it's decided by war, because that's how the dollar became supreme in the first place. 2 world wars were fought by which American imperialism participated in, culminating in its victory in the Second World War, in which it became the global hegemon. That what we're seeing is a crisis of US imperialism, which it attempts to resolve through war. It's not going to go peacefully into the good night. It's going to, and is, fighting to preserve its position through the only means possible, that is, ultimately, economic warfare and military warfare to follow. So this is the crucial question. It's not a matter of choosing between this capitalist policy or that capitalist policy, globalization versus tariffs. No, these are all expressions of the deep-seated crisis of the capitalist system, and that is the central task facing the working class, to overthrow that system. Because the crisis of the dollar, the crisis of the debt, the crisis of treasury markets displays vividly that this system is historically outmoded and must be removed unless if it continues to exist, it will plunge mankind into unspeakable barbarism. That's the issue of the day.
Thank you, Nick. And very much that is front and centre in this election campaign that we have launched, the necessity for world socialist revolution, that it is not, as Nick indicated, a question of prediction, this or that policy, the capitalist elite, but above all, a new program and perspective needs to be introduced into the working class, of which our party alone in this country carries out in conjunction with our sister parties internationally. And for this work, we very much require resources. And so I would now like to call for a collection for our $60,000 election fund. But I will just make the point that those here will need to just listen carefully, as the rules and regulations around campaign donations are particularly burdensome. Just before I do, I'd like to just remind everybody in that sense of the process it took to get to this point of the campaign. As some of our electoral members who are in attendance will know, we launched a more than 6-month-long campaign to gain the necessary 1,500 members to become a registered party. Despite meeting all the onerous requirements of the AEC, and after 4 months of keeping us in the dark, more than 4 months, the AEC rejected our registration. They have to this date refused to provide us with concrete information about who they claim denied being a member, which they used to justify their decision. Having been denied the right to have our name on the ballot paper, we engaged in a campaign to collect more than 750 signatures so we could stand our 7 candidates. Having again completed the requirements of the AEC, it then took them an inordinate amount of time to confirm our nomination. In fact, it took them days, despite promising it would only take hours. We also had to pay $2,000 per candidate to stand, which they classify as a deposit, but it is only refunded if we are elected or receive 4% of the primary vote. Look, I go through these processes to demonstrate the anti-democratic nature of the entire process of standing in the election. Every mechanism is designed by the state to ensure the parties with the biggest bank accounts, biggest corporate backers, and are already in power remain in power. They do not need to submit 1,500 members or collect signatures for nominations. They will receive a full refund of their deposit. Moreover, they will be paid an immediate sum of $12,379 for receiving 4% or more of the vote, and then a further nearly $3.5, so $3.50 per eligible vote they received. And certainly in 2022, I think the Labor Party received something like 27 million and the Liberals 26 million. I mean, you know, in comparison to smaller parties, I mean, they receive not only funding, but do not have to complete these anti-democratic and onerous tasks set out by the AEC. And in the same vein, the AEC has strict and anti-democratic rules on who can donate for election spending in Australia, which does not affect the major parties because most of their revenue is either from rich individuals or corporate donors, or, as I went through, directly from the AEC, you know, that is state funding itself. So this is why, this is a component part of why we have launched the $60,000 election fund. And for that, we need your support, and we ask you to give generously. We've already paid the $14,000 to stand, and we will use this money for our election fund, to expand our campaign, print our statements, and bring our perspectives into the working class, as well as booking and holding public meetings, election campaign committee meetings. Now, unlike, as I said, the major parties, we must ask to gather information from those who donate tonight to ensure we do meet the AEC's thoroughly anti-democratic definition of what they call a foreign donor. So if you are not considered a foreign donor, therefore can donate to our election campaign. If you are an Australian elector registered on the AEC electoral roll, an Australian citizen, so any Australian citizen can donate, an Australian resident, so if you're a resident in Australia, or a New Zealand citizen who holds a subclass 444 special category visa, you can all donate to our campaign. If you are not any of these, while you cannot donate directly to our campaign, we encourage you to donate to the WSWS, and the donation link, this is only if you don't fit those categories. And if you're confused or unsure, just let us know and we can discuss it afterwards. But you can donate to the WSWS, which there'll be a link in the chat for that. To ensure we comply with the AEC rules, for all donations between $100 up to $999, we require your contact details, including full name, email, or phone number, one of the two. So if you're donating $100 or above and we don't have your contact details, make sure you leave them in the chat so we can contact you. For any donations under $100, this is not required. For any donations $1,000 or more, we require a signed affirmation that you are not a foreign donor. So we will also need your contact details in order for us to get that signed affirmation from you. And finally, if you donate cumulatively, so not in one, but over the course of a number of donations or in one donation, $16,900 or more to our campaign, this must be disclosed to the Australian Electoral Commission. Look, I understand, I'm sure everyone in the audience is thinking this is a painful task, and it is. But we must follow these rules to comply with the IYSSE requirements. And as I said at the beginning, we do ask you give generously to our campaign, which, as our speakers and in the discussion have all indicated, is absolutely critical, this campaign in this period. As I said, I understand these rules are onerous. They are onerous by design. But we, despite these obstacles that are put in front of us, we are fighting to bring the only socialist and internationalist perspective of any political party in this country into this campaign, which, as I think all our speakers indicated, is absolutely necessary in this crucial period. I would now like to move on to some announcements. Well, there's 3 books that I would like to advertise tonight that I really encourage all who are in attendance, if you haven't got copies, to purchase them through Mehring Books. One of the critical aspects of developing your understanding and consciousness, which was really emphasised, I think, by the speakers tonight, is the necessity of historical understanding. So as part of that, we very much encourage you to begin to build and develop your Marxist library. And the 3 books we'll advertise tonight, the first one is Why They Back by Christoph Andrea, which goes through the development and the return and revitalization of fascism, which certainly occurred first and foremost in Germany as it was begun to become normalized, which has been a historic process that really has led today to not only the return of the far right in multiple European countries, the legitimization of neo-Nazi parties, but also the development and building of the fascistic Trump administration and his out and out, some of them fascist advisors. This book goes for $20 as a paperback plus delivery if you get it from Mehring Books, or $7 if you'd like a digital copy, which I do encourage you to build your digital library. You can get that, read it on the go. It's very important, and you can get that immediately. The next book is The Logic of Zionism, From Nationalist Myth to the Gaza Genocide. Now, this is the second edition we have of this book, which is a series of lectures presented and prepared by David North, who's the international chairperson of the World Socialist website, which traces through the reactionary ideological and political foundations of Zionism. It also calls for powerful and united action amongst for the Palestinian people and the Israeli working class against this reactionary ideology. And I think it is a critical book in understanding the situation that's now unfolding and continuing to unfold in Gaza, the genocide itself, and the role of Zionism. And I think certainly Morgan, in his report, detailed the role that now is being played by the big lie of equating Zionism with anti-Semitism, which this, I think, traces through very importantly and dismisses that, as well as traces the actual origins of Zionism itself. That's $20 for that paperback and $9, again, digital copy, which I very much encourage everyone here to get. Finally, we have Sounding the Alarm, Socialism Against War, which is $26 paperback and $12 for e-publication. And this is a collection of a series of speeches delivered by David North in the international online May Day rallies we hold every year between 2014 and 2024. I mean, these put together are extraordinary in working over the analysis of our party, of the ICFI, of the relentless escalation of imperialist militarism and the growing danger of nuclear Third World War. When placed together, you can see the process unfold year after year, and the analysis of the ICFI through those years, which in that sense have been vindicated through the developments that have led to today, in which World War is not only on the cards but has really begun with the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. And now we're seeing it develop together into a far greater and more devastating potential war as the United States, or US imperialism, seeks to cut off its chief economic rival, China. So I really encourage everybody here to purchase this seminal book. Finally, we will be holding a series of meetings. This will not be our only one. This is just our first for this important election campaign. And already we have a series of meetings that are being held in the different areas, which are IYSSE, that's our youth section, International Youth and Students for Social Equality, which is entitled Fight Against War and Dictatorship, Join the Socialist Equality Party's Election Campaign. You can see on your screen the locations of the different meetings. They will also put them in the chat. We will be holding, the first ones will be this Sunday, April 13th, in Newcastle and Brisbane at 2 p.m. They'll both be held in person on campus, but there'll also be an online component, which we can send the links out to that. We are also holding it in Sydney, a meeting in Sydney. That is Tuesday, April 15th at 12:30 p.m. Again, this will be at WSU University, Parramatta South Campus. And finally, on April 16th, we're holding the meeting at Melbourne University at 12:30 p.m. Again, we'll put all the details in the chat, but I very much encourage those who are here today to register to attend, come in person if you can, and certainly begin to build and develop this campaign, which one critical component of will be on the campuses and amongst students and young people. We will also, following this meeting, send out an email to those who are attending, notifying them of when we're holding our election committee meetings, which we will be holding in the various areas to seek to build and develop our campaign. Those will be held sometimes in person, sometimes online, will depend in different ways, but we will be holding them. They will involve discussions on the political situation and then an outline of the work that is required to build our campaign, the distribution of our statements, the campaigning in various working class areas. And as we get closer to election day, early polling booths and the polling booths themselves. We need your support and help in all of this, and we'll send that out in an email following this meeting as we have all your email addresses. And finally, I encourage everybody here today to make the most important decision of your life and join the Socialist Equality Party. As you can see on screen, what we have there is our statement of principles, which can also be purchased from Mehring Books, which outline the basic concepts of the SEP. But to join as a full member is to really join the ranks of the Revolutionary Party. I think the contributions made by the various candidates today, in particular Morgan, but also Keo, of their own experience in coming towards the movement is, I think, both moving, but also reveals the process of the development of consciousness. And I think that there can't be any other alternative than the fight for socialist revolution. I mean, there were comments in the chat about the question of lesser evilism, about alternatives. Well, I think the point that has come up front and center is there is no other alternative but world socialist revolution. And for that, the world requires the development of a vanguard party, a socialist party. And so I encourage everybody here today, click on the link that is in the chat, fill out that you would like to join the SEP. Someone will be in contact with you and we will have a discussion about the processes to becoming a full member. There are electoral members who are in the chat or in the meeting today. That is a very important form of membership. But the next step is to become a full member of the Socialist Equality Party, which I also encourage every electoral member here to do.
Authorised by Cheryl Crisp for the Socialist Equality Party, Level 1/457 to 459 Elizabeth Street, Surrey Hills, New South Wales, 2010, Australia.